is Saturday Agenda.
Hello, welcome to Saturday Agenda. I'm Tom Connell. Well, it's a cliche, but it has been a big week in politics, of course, headlined by Holden's decision to leave the Australian shores, leave or cease making cars here in Australia from 2017. That happened, of course, in the final week of Parliament for 2013. It's been a tumultuous year in which we've seen three Prime Ministers, the current of which, Tony Abbott, of course, rode to victory in September saying he'd repeal the carbon tax, but he's been frustrated in terms of that being repealed in the Senate. They didn't even get to vote on it this week. And of course we had the COAG meeting yesterday, headlined by the one-stop shop environmental announcement with the state signing on with the federal government to try to streamline that approvals process. Well, to talk through the week's events, I've got Labor's Shadow Parliamentary Secretary, Matt Thistlethwaite. He's in our CBD studio. And also in Melbourne we have Parliamentary Secretary Josh Frydenberg joining us as well. Gentlemen, thank you both for your time today.
G'day, Tom.
G'day, Tom. Nice to be with you, and g'day, Matt.
G'day, Josh. How are you, mate?
I'm going to start. Good to see we've got off to a friendly start. I'm going to start off with you, Josh Frydenberg, on this issue of Holden. The Victorian Premier Denis Napthine wants more money given to Toyota. That's the next focus, of course, the last surviving manufacturer here in Australia, who wants more money to Toyota to shore up its future. Tony Abbott's already said no more money is going to be on the table. Now, given the $1 billion is there already in that fund, do you think that whole lot should in the future be channelled towards Toyota to try to make sure it does survive?
Look, Tom, that will be worked out in due course, but $1 billion is a lot of money through the automotive transformation scheme, and we really do want Toyota to stay. The problem for Holden was the perfect storm that Mike Devereaux referred to, essentially, which was the high Australian dollar, the high costs and the low volumes. And Labor's, finger pointing on this issue was disgraceful during the week, because under Labor, Mitsubishi and Ford both closed. They introduced a carbon tax which increased the cost for making a domestic made vehicle in Australia by nearly $400. They brought great uncertainty to the industry with their changes to the FBT, which they flagged before the election. They had the cash for clunkers, the green car scheme, which didn't ever eventuate, and they had no policy ideas for the car industry. So the finger pointing from Labor was disgraceful. We want Toyota to stay, and we will help them do that.
Well, we've heard that you want and that Tony Abbott wants Toyota to stay. We've also heard, though, the coalition talk about wanting the car industry to stand on its own 2 feet. How can Australia be the only country in the world without subsidies towards a car industry?
Well, we do have that automotive transformation scheme. It's $1 billion.
No, but that goal I was talking about eventually having it stand on its own 2 feet, that doesn't seem very realistic, does it?
Well, I think if we can try to lower the costs for those companies, and by getting rid of the carbon tax, that's one automatic means of doing that, then I think they can do much more better themselves without the need for taxpayer-funded subsidies. But the point here is we want Toyota to stay. We'll be working with them, but we also think, at this difficult time about the families affected by the Holden closure, and we'll be working with the various state governments and with the company of Holden to ensure that the difficulties are mitigated.
Matt Thistlethwaite, another thing that many car manufacturers around the world have, or countries have in recent years, is taken major pay cuts. Now, Australian workers get paid a lot more than some of these other nations. Should they have taken the lead, for example, of the US and taken some significant pay cuts in the last few years to help make that industry stay in Australia?
Well, Australian workers deserve the wages that they get, and these are high-skilled jobs, Tom. They're not unskilled professions, they're highly skilled occupations, and in Australia we value those sorts of jobs because they create productivity. You ask people to undertake education, to undertake training for those highly skilled jobs. It's about ensuring that we're ultimately more productive as an economy. But really,
are they all? Sorry, Matt. Are they all high-skilled jobs, though? I mean, are there people there getting paid commensurately more than they would in other industries because of these subsidies?
Look, even at the base level of work, there's a degree of training that goes into automotive professions, and you work your way up from there. And there's a distinct career path leading to things as apprenticeships, to computer-aided design and manufacturing work. They're all highly skilled technical jobs, and they're the sort of jobs that we want to be encouraging in the Australian economy. But ultimately, this is a question of whether or not the Australian government wants an automotive industry in Australia or not. As you mentioned earlier, there's no government in the world that doesn't subsidise their automotive industry, and the subsidy in Australia is very cheap. It's about $18 per person compared to $268 in the United States. So we really need to make a decision about whether we want a domestic automotive industry. And I think you'd have to say, based on what's gone on in the Parliament this week, the atrocious approach of Joe Hockey daring Holden to put up or shut up, the approach of taking $500 million out of the assistance package in the lead up to the election, no clear direction for where you want to take manufacturing in this country. You'd have to say that this government isn't committed to supporting an ongoing domestic automotive industry.
Well, that's just a joke, and you know that, Matt. One way we're going to support the manufacturing industry is to get rid of that carbon tax, which is a monkey on its back. But, you know, we're going to talk straight to the Australian people and be very honest with them about the cost of subsidies. And, you know, the problem with the last Labor government, with Julia Gillard's Labor government, was that she went out in 2012, offered more money to the car manufacturers, and then said, you know, we've got a commitment from Holden that they're staying here to 2022, and that never eventuated. So effectively, you know, she made a commitment to the Australian people which was never going to be kept. And the problem for the Labor Party is you do not walk the talk when it comes to supporting the car industry, because you've saddled them with the carbon tax.
Well, I'm going to have to move on. I'm going to have to move on there. Sorry, Matt. We've got a few topics to cover. Just on Qantas, Matt Thistlethwaite, to ask you, there are reports today that the PM's very much open to Qantas's request to change the Qantas Sale Act to increase foreign ownership. Would that be something Labor would support?
Well, look, this again appears to be policy on the run. Certainly, Qantas is an iconic Australian airline. It's a big issue for me. Qantas is probably one of the largest employers of people in my electorate, with Kingsford Smith Airport being within its boundaries. So it's a very big issue for my electorate and for people in my community. And I've been receiving some correspondence from employees of Qantas who are concerned about their futures. I think Qantas needs to formulate its view on what it wants to happen in terms of the government's approach.
But well, the indications are that it does want to be able to compete and have that foreign capital in. So would Labor support, if Qantas is requesting that, would Labor support the government going ahead and changing the Qantas Sale Act?
Well, Tom, that's a change, because I received a number of emails that were forwarded by Qantas employees last week, which was an email from Alan Joyce, the CEO, which painted a different picture, I must say. So that's a change. But look, I think you need to look at it in this context. The Qantas Sale Act is there for good reason. It's to ensure that we have a national carrier here that is unique to Australia. It's part of our culture, part of our ongoing economic growth. And I think you can say fairly that if the Qantas Sale Act wasn't around, remember there was an opportunity for private equity, and they were seeking to buy into Qantas in the early 2000s. Given what happened to private equity in the global financial crisis, you could probably fairly say that if we didn't have the Qantas Sale Act, because of what happened to private equity during the global financial crisis, Qantas would not be here today. So the Qantas Sale Act has value in our economy, and I don't think that we just need to be making willy-nilly decisions to get rid of it on a whim.
Josh Frydenberg, this was a discussion Joe Hockey wanted to raise. It seems as though there could be a fairly quick conclusion, at least in terms of what Qantas might want, according to these reports in the AFR today. Is this something you'd be comfortable with?
Look, Matt Thistlethwaite and I do agree on one thing, which is Qantas is an iconic Australian brand that we want to survive and to prosper. It employs more than 30,000 people. It's been around nearly 100 years. It is the spirit of Australia. It would be negligent of us not to investigate the various ways we could help Qantas to survive and to prosper. So this is a conversation that both Joe Hockey and Tony Abbott said they're happy to have with the company, they're happy to have with the Australian people, but ultimately, if you were to change the ownership restrictions, then that would be an issue for the Australian Parliament.
Right, I'm going to move on. The COAG meeting yesterday, one of the stories that came out of it was to do with the NDIS. Now, Prime Minister Tony Abbott said that the launch sites were not launch sites, they're trial sites. He says that he wants to learn lessons out of them and perhaps change implementation. He also noted that costs so far appear to be higher than expected. Josh Frydenberg, is this readying the ground for a scaling back of the scope of the NDIS?
Oh, absolutely not. Look, we're very proud of the fact that the NDIS has received bipartisan support right from the start. This was one of the only good things that came out of the last Parliament. And I believe that people with disabilities have had a raw deal, and so have their families and their carers for many, many years. And the NDIS is going to help fill that void. So
and I don't think anyone disagrees with that.
Sure.
But just in terms of the cost, if there are big blowouts, do you think the parameters of who and how much they'll be covered, are you saying they'll be unchanged regardless of the cost?
Look, that's an issue for the Minister, Mitch Fifield, to work through with the various stakeholders. But, you know, ultimately we want to see an effective and efficient NDIS. So, you know, that's a long way down the track. The key point here is to learn from these trials, and I'm sure there is going to be bipartisan support for a fully funded and fair NDIS going into the future.
Matt, I'd like to ask you about the one-stop shops, these environmental approvals the states agreed to, including Labor states with the federal government. Why does federal Labor have a problem with these?
Well, Tom, because during Labor's period in office, we had some of the strongest business investment, particularly in the mining sector, in our nation's history. But we managed that in accordance with an environmental policy that ensured that we protected some of our most important natural assets, most particularly the Great Barrier Reef. We were a government that created the largest network of marine reserves. We reached an historic deal in Tasmania to preserve old-growth forests, and we just see some of those environmental reforms and protections that were put in place by Labor to establish that wonderful national heritage, that listing of assets that are important to Australia, being whittled away. And
you'd agree. So you'd agree in
change.
general, but want essential a final, just quickly, a final veto. What, for the federal government? You'd agree with the principle of it, though?
Well, it wasn't always a final veto. The Environment, Biodiversity and Conservation Act said that in certain circumstances there was a process that the Federal Environment Minister had to go through before approving any development, and that was to ensure, particularly and predominantly, the protection of threatened species. I'd hate to see that particular element of that Act whittled away for the sake of trying to get some sort of agreement and to placate some of these premiers throughout the states.
Tom, can I just say,
I
just think this is a great win for Tony Abbott and for Greg Hunt. We've done something that
we've
done something that Labor never was able to do, which was to set up these one-stop shops and to get all 8 state and territory jurisdictions to sign on to these MOUs of understanding will really cut green tape from the economy and help speed up these environmental approval processes. The BCA documented one case where a company seeking environmental approval in Australia spent more than $20 million. It took them more than 2 years, 4,000 meetings, a 12,000-page report. And then when the environmental approval came back, Tom, it had 1,500 conditions attached, 1,200 at the state level, 300 at the federal level, and 8,000 sub-conditions. And, you know, when we think about the fact that capital in today's world is mobile and we're competing against other jurisdictions, how can we make companies go through that process? So these one-stop shops will really make a difference. It's cutting green tape. It's something that Labor never did, and it's a real credit to Greg Hunt and to Tony Abbott.
Would you have liked, though, Josh, to have seen any sort of final veto reserved? I mean, from my understanding, this is still a bit of a fluid agreement. Would you still like to see the federal government have some sort of a veto at the end of the process if they thought something had been not looked at properly?
No, these are very good agreements, and there is checks and balances within these agreements to ensure that the federal government is intimately involved. So I think this is a really big win for the coalition. all 8 jurisdictions signing on. The Business Council of Australia, the other industry groups have all welcomed these one-stop shops, and I think this will see a sea change in the way that this government is able to keep its commitment to cut red and green tape.
Matt Thistlethwaite, the COAG meeting yesterday seemed to go pretty smoothly for a new government, even with some Labor counterparts. Tony Abbott getting them to the negotiating table pretty well, would you say?
Well, it was a scheduled meeting. Of course they were all going to turn up, but I think it was a wasted opportunity. Certainly I don't think that the South Australian or Victorian premiers are too happy about what's happening in the automotive industry. They've certainly voiced their opposition and concern about the approach that the federal government's taken this week, particularly in the Parliament, in respect of Holden. There was a process that was put in place by Labor in government of a seamless national economy, of reducing much of that regulation and differences in regulation that existed between the states. Things like trade certificates and licensing arrangements. We've heard nothing of any of that process that was going on under Labor. That's all been forgotten about and put on the back burner by this government. So I think there's been some wasted opportunities yesterday.
All right, we are going to have to take a quick break. Do stay with us here on Saturday Agenda. After the break, we'll look at MyEFO, of course, a mid-year budget update to be outlined on Tuesday. Welcome back to Saturday Agenda, our political panel today. We have Labor's Shadow Parliamentary Secretary, Matt Thistlethwaite, and also Josh Frydenberg, Parliamentary Secretary as well, joining us. I'd like to move on to MyEFO, of course, the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook, which is being provided by Joe Hockey on Tuesday. Reports are that it's going to show a deficit of $50 billion, more of a blowout. That does take into account, of course, the RBA's cash injection the government's going to have, which is nearly $9 billion. But Matt Thistlethwaite, that would still appear to show about $1 billion a week written off since the election. It seems to show that Labor had a real structural deficit in that budget by the end of its term in office.
Well, when Labor released the pre-election fiscal outlook, the figures were for a deficit of $30.1 billion. We're told the speculation is that it's going to be $50 billion. That's what you can call the hockey hike. That's the increase that's been undertaken by this government in the level of deficit in only 3 months. And I think what's really going on here is this is a bit of deliberate strategy by the government to make the budget look as worse as it possibly can. The $8 billion loan to the Reserve Bank, increasing the debt limit, getting rid of some of Labor's savings measures. It's all about making the budget look as bad as it possibly can, so that when they enter their new budget next year, they're going to cut to the bone and make it look much better for themselves. So that's really what's going on here. That's a hockey hike for $20 billion.
One of those savings measures Labor opposed as well, its own one on higher education. You've also got several $1 billion, it appears. We don't know the figure yet, but this appears to be, at least in part, simply the way the economy's headed. Is there not a structural deficit that Labor allowed to set into the budget?
Look, we were very clear in the last budget and in PFO about the savings measures that needed to be achieved. They were all part of Labor's plan, and we had a great record in government of funding all of the programs that we were putting in place. We were funding the National Disability Insurance Scheme. We were funding the Gonski reforms for the full 6 years rather than the 3 years. And we were managing the budget so that we could achieve those savings to fund those programs. Since Joe Hockey and Tony Abbott have had their hands on the purse strings, it's exploded. And you've got this massive hike, the hockey hike of $20 billion that's now being undertaken to make the budget look much worse than it actually is.
Josh Frydenberg, we don't know the numbers yet, but ultimately there will be cuts. We know that. I'm sure you'll tell us why as well. What areas would you like to see quarantined, and what areas do you think there's some fat to trim?
Well, look, Tony Abbott has said he's going to quarantine defence as well as medical research, but Tuesday will be an opportunity to air Labor's dirty linen, because they have bequeathed us a huge fiscal mess, Tom. $300 billion of debt. Don't forget here that when we left government in 2007, there was zero government debt and there was more than $50 billion in the bank. Labor promised us more than 600 times there would be a budget surplus, but they delivered the 5 biggest budget deficits in the history of the Commonwealth of Australia. So we've got $300 billion of debt and growing. The interest bill is around $10 billion a year. That's 10 teaching hospitals that could be built every year around the country just by without that interest bill that Labor has left us. So, you know, Tuesday will be an important statement, but we really are cleaning up Labor's mess.
All right, well, we'll wait and see what happens on that Tuesday. I'd just like to move on to asylum seekers briefly. We had, of course, the latest update to Operation Sovereign Borders yesterday. Within that news that the Salvation Army's contract is going to be cancelled. Now, they were providing, amongst other things, humanitarian assistance, education and recreational assistance to asylum seekers staying in offshore processing in Nauru and also Manus Island. Now, the contract's been cancelled. The Minister says that the government's been forced to make contract changes because of the way the system was being administered by the Labor government, but he's refused to be drawn on why and also if there'll be any sort of replacement to that service. Josh Frydenberg, we know the Minister's previously said that there are issues that are obviously operationally sensitive. How does this fit into this category? Shouldn't he explain what's happening here?
Well, look, you know, we are having to make these changes to the various contracts because, again, there's a budget black hole here. It turns out that Labor didn't allocate the $1.2 billion necessary for the offshore processing.
But is that it? So is this just, sorry Josh, is this just down to cost, that they couldn't afford to keep paying the Salvation Army to provide these services, and is there going to be no replacement?
Well, look, I understand that Scott Morrison is looking at all the services that are being provided and wants to put in place the most effective system. So he'll have more to say about that, Tom. But the point here is there's a $1.2 billion black hole with money that should have been allocated for placing unauthorised boat arrivals offshore. Labor was only going to put 1 in 6 unauthorised boat arrivals offshore. The rest were going to be allowed on bridging visas into the community. We want to see all unauthorised boat arrivals go offshore, and you know, we've had huge success in just the first few months of Operation Sovereign Borders with numbers down around 80%. So that's going to reduce the cost on the taxpayer. It's going to lead to less lives being lost at sea, and it's certainly a lot better than the mess that the Labor Party left us.
Matt Thistlethwaite, Labor has criticised the government over the secrecy over Operation Sovereign Borders. It's not alone there, but when you were in power, almost all media access was banned in terms of those same offshore processing centres. Why was that needed?
Well, look, the point to make about all of this, Tom, is there's no reason for this secrecy. You've mentioned the contract with the Salvation Army. No reason given whatsoever. Now, the claim that their government makes about the integrity of the operation, I think, is in no way related to the secrecy in relation to this contract. But I have to take issue with what Josh said earlier about processing. Under Labor's regional resettlement arrangement, it was very clear, and we made this clear to people smugglers, that if you got to Australia, you would be resettled in Papua New Guinea. Now, the architecture of that part of the scheme has been left in place by this government. For one reason, they know that it's working. It's reducing the numbers.
But on that same, just finally, Matt, this way, on that same level, the secrecy Labor had in terms of no media access to offshore processing, why was that needed?
Well, that was done in conjunction with the operators of the centres. It was done in conjunction with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. We ensured that everyone had full access to appropriate medical, to educational facilities, and they got the highest quality standards provided by organisations such as the Salvation Army. But this government has again made a decision for no apparent reason, and they're not telling the Australian public. It's another example of this policy that's in disarray.
We are, I'm afraid, right out of time. Thank you both for your time today, gentlemen, and thank you for watching Saturday Agenda. Stay with us for all of the day's news, sport and weather coming up.